For nearly 45 years, Thomas Grady kept quiet watch over the Beacon Cliff Lighthouse. So when he radioed in a report about strange lights at sea, he expected maybe a Coast Guard cutter by sunrise. What he didn't expect was a team of Navy SEALs turning his living room into a classified command center by morning. Welcome to HAI Stories. Let's dive into this unbelievable story of a forgotten lighthouse keeper whose eyes still saw what machines could not. At 69 years old, Thomas Grady was one of the last of a dying breed, an old-school lighthouse keeper in a world that had mostly forgotten such a job even existed. Perched high above the rocky cliffs of Beacon Cliff, his post overlooked the cold, unpredictable waters off the coast of Maine. For nearly 45 years, Thomas had kept quiet watch, through nor'easters and calm summer nights, through automation and budget cuts that replaced keepers with machines. But the Department of Coastal Navigation had made an exception for Thomas. They said his experience was too valuable to lose. And they were right. He wasn't much for small talk, rarely left the lighthouse, and kept company with his golden retriever, Rusty, a dog nearly as old and weathered as he was. But every morning, Thomas climbed the spiral staircase to the observation deck with the same determination he had on his first day. He checked the light, logged the weather, and scanned the sea with eyes that, while a little slower now, still caught things most others would miss. Locals in the nearby town of Port Halley affectionately called him the Watchman. Tourists rarely saw him. He didn't want the attention. He wasn't in it for glory. He believed in duty, routine, and the quiet honor of keeping others safe, even if they didn't know he was doing it. But all of that changed one clear November night, when Thomas spotted something in the water he couldn't explain, something that didn't belong. And when he picked up the radio to call it in, he had no idea that his world, his lighthouse, his life, was about to become the front line of a top-secret military operation. It began like any other night. Thomas Grady stood on the narrow observation deck of Beacon Cliff Lighthouse, the cold Atlantic wind tugging at his flannel jacket. Rusty lay curled up beside the heater inside, already half asleep. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the black canvas overhead like shattered glass, and the sea below looked calm, almost deceptively so. But something felt off. Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on it. The currents were quiet. No storms were expected. And yet, the air carried a tension he'd learned to trust after decades of watching the ocean. He lifted his old binoculars and scanned the horizon, north, then east. And that's when he saw them. Lights. Strange ones. They shimmered, small at first, then grew brighter. Not the steady rhythm of a fishing boat or the slow pulse of a cargo ship. These lights hovered, danced almost, then, just as quickly, dropped below the surface. Thomas blinked, refocused. Then they reappeared, miles away, moving impossibly fast, as though something underwater was darting just beneath the waves. He lowered his binoculars, frowned. In all his years, through storms, false alarms, and odd sightings, he'd never seen anything move like that. He reached for his logbook, flipped to a fresh page, and jotted down the time, weather, coordinates, and his observations in his neat, careful handwriting. Then he picked up the radio. Coast Guard station, this is Beacon Cliff Lighthouse. Do you copy? Over. There was a brief pause, followed by static, then a voice. Copy, Beacon Cliff. Go ahead. I'm observing some unusual light patterns out at sea, approximately 8 nautical miles northeast of my position. They're not consistent with any standard vessel movement. They appear, disappear, then reappear in different locations. Can you confirm you're not seeing reflections or atmospheric phenomena? Negative. Skies are clear, visibility excellent. These aren't weather-related. The voice on the other end shifted, becoming more alert. Understood, Beacon Cliff. We'll log the report and dispatch a patrol to investigate in the morning. Please continue to monitor and advise if anything changes. Will do. Beacon Cliff out. He signed off and returned to the railing. The lights were still there, flickering like ghosts on the water. He stayed there for hours, watching, sketching their patterns on a small notepad, noting how they moved in a deliberate sequence, not random, not natural. At 3:12 a.m., the lights disappeared completely. Thomas stared at the empty sea for another half hour before finally descending the spiral staircase to his living quarters. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and tried to shake the unease curling in his chest. Probably nothing, Rusty, he said aloud as the dog lifted his head. Could be one of those oceanographic survey ships, or some new kind of mapping tech. But he didn't believe it. The Institute didn't operate in this part of the coast. Too rocky, too shallow in places. And besides, he'd seen their lights before. He could name every vessel by its light pattern if you asked him. This was different. Too fast, too controlled, too precise. He turned off the stove, let the kettle cool. They'll look into it tomorrow, he told himself. But deep down, he knew something else. Tomorrow wouldn't be routine. Whatever he'd seen, it had triggered something bigger than a standard Coast Guard follow-up. Thomas climbed into bed, but barely slept. His mind replayed the way the lights had moved, the eerie silence that accompanied them, the strange energy in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was down there in the dark, watching, measuring, waiting. And he was right. By the time dawn broke over the Atlantic, Thomas Grady's lighthouse, once ignored, overlooked, and forgotten, was already on the radar of the highest levels of naval intelligence. And the next knock on his door wouldn't be from the Coast Guard. It would come from men who didn't wear name tags, in black vehicles with no markings, carrying equipment he couldn't begin to understand. Rusty would be the first to hear them. And Thomas Grady's life was about to become anything but ordinary. The next morning, just as the first light broke across the Atlantic horizon, Thomas Grady was already up, standing by his kitchen window with a steaming mug of black coffee. The strange lights were gone, but the feeling in his gut that something had shifted still lingered. Rusty barked once, then growled low in his throat. That was unusual. Thomas followed his gaze out the window and froze. 3 black SUVs, followed by 2 unmarked vans, were pulling up the narrow gravel road that led to the lighthouse, a road that rarely saw traffic at all. The vehicles parked in a tight formation, and within seconds, men in tactical gear began stepping out, moving with silent precision. Thomas set his mug down slowly. What in the world? Before he could finish the thought, there was a sharp knock on the door. He glanced at Rusty, who stood rigid beside him, ears forward. Taking a breath, Thomas straightened his flannel shirt and opened the door. A tall man in his 40s stood on the porch. Civilian clothes, but with a stance and presence that spoke volumes. His eyes scanned the interior briefly before settling on Thomas. "Mr. Grady," he said, producing a leather folder with official-looking credentials. "Commander Jacob Harrington, United States Naval Special Warfare Command." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "That's a mouthful. May we come in? We need to speak with you about your report from last night." Behind Harrington, more personnel were already unloading equipment from the vans. Cases marked classified, tripods, monitors, antennae, and cables. Thomas hesitated. This wasn't a conversation. It was an operation. He stepped aside. "Don't suppose I really have a choice, do I? We'd appreciate your cooperation," Harrington replied diplomatically, though the sound of crates being carried across the gravel said otherwise. Inside, Thomas offered coffee out of habit. The commander accepted. While the kettle heated, more men entered, setting up what looked disturbingly like a temporary command center right there in his living room. "Mr. Grady," Harrington said once they were seated, "your report last night coincided with intelligence we've been monitoring. What you saw wasn't a weather anomaly or research vessel." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Didn't think it was. We're tracking what we believe to be a foreign unmanned underwater vehicle, a prototype drone submarine conducting unauthorized mapping of U.S. seafloor territory." Thomas whistled softly. "So, spying." A younger officer, introduced as Lieutenant Commander Reyes, cracked a dry smile. "We call it unauthorized intelligence gathering. But yes, essentially. Your location here," Harrington continued, "makes this lighthouse the perfect vantage point for real-time monitoring. We're requesting to set up temporary operations from inside your facility." At that moment, 2 techs wheeled in a mobile radar console. Rusty growled and retreated under the kitchen table. Thomas glanced around at his once quiet home. Now a flurry of activity, cables snaking across the floor, portable screens glowing, voices speaking in military code. "Well," he muttered, "when I called in those lights, I figured I'd get a Coast Guard cutter and maybe a young officer with a clipboard. Not a living room full of Navy SEALs." Harrington gave the faintest smile. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Grady." By noon, Beacon Cliff Lighthouse was no longer just a lighthouse. It was a fully functional military command post. Satellite uplinks, sonar feeds, and communication relays now shared space with Thomas's vintage radio set and bookshelf full of weather logs. The old lighthouse, once passed over by modernization, was now at the center of a national security operation. And surprisingly, Thomas wasn't just watching it happen. He was part of it. His decades of experience made him an irreplaceable asset. He pointed out underwater ridges not marked on modern maps, blind spots in radar coverage, and currents only a local would know. This here, he said, tapping the sonar screen, is a false deep. Chart says 80 feet, but it rises to under 20 near the reef. A good hiding spot. Harrington looked over his shoulder. This is exactly the kind of insight we don't get from satellites or sonar alone. Thomas felt something he hadn't in years, needed, trusted, alive. The day wore on. The room filled with quiet tension. Everyone waiting for the foreign UUV to show itself again. But Thomas wasn't just waiting. He was watching, and for the first time in a long while, his watch truly mattered. And deep inside, he sensed the game was just beginning. Thomas Grady stood in the middle of his own living room, now overrun with high-tech equipment, cables, and hushed military chatter. Monitors flickered with sonar readings and live satellite feeds. Radios buzzed with encrypted updates, and outside, antenna arrays sprouted from the gallery like mechanical weeds. And yet, in the midst of all the noise and technology, it was Thomas they kept turning to. He wasn't just the man who'd spotted the lights. He was the man who understood the sea, its moods, its tricks, its silence. For years, Thomas had felt like a relic, left behind in the tide of progress. The lighthouse had long since gone automated. Most people in Port Halley thought the place was just a museum now, a dusty old relic maintained out of sentiment. But the Department of Coastal Navigation had kept Thomas on, half out of tradition, half because no one knew the waters like he did. Now, that forgotten wisdom had become the centerpiece of a mission that even the Navy's finest couldn't execute without him. This current here, Thomas said, leaning over the sonar display, splits just north of Devil's Shelf. If your drone keeps that same track, it'll veer right into the thermal vent field. Commander Harrington furrowed his brow. How dangerous is it? Thomas didn't answer right away. He picked up a pencil and sketched a rough diagram, more precise than any digital chart in the room. That area is called the Devil's Kitchen for a reason, he said calmly. Volcanic vents under the seabed. Once a month, right around the full moon, they release a thermal plume that scrambles electronics and surges up to the surface. Anything in there gets cooked. And when's the next one? Reyes asked. Thomas looked out the window, the moon rising in the early evening sky. Tonight. Starts around 9 p.m. Peaks at midnight. Local boats clear the area every time. It's old knowledge, but not the kind you find on charts. For a moment, the entire room was quiet. Thomas's voice carried the weight of certainty, the kind only earned through a lifetime of observation. Not data, not guesswork, lived truth. So if the drone keeps on its course, Harrington began. It's going to fry, Thomas finished, and you'll have your window to retrieve it. Plans were drawn. Teams mobilized. Recovery vessels were deployed just beyond the danger zone. Passive tracking was maintained. No interference, no sudden movements. All they had to do now was wait. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lighthouse came alive again, its beacon casting a slow, steady beam across the darkening sea. And Thomas stood at his post, just as he had for nearly 5 decades, gazing out into the unknown. Commander Harrington joined him. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Grady?" Thomas smiled faintly. His face was lined from years of salt air and long nights, but his eyes were sharp, clearer than ever. "Thinking about purpose, I guess," he said quietly. "How last week? I was just some old man watching a light no one cared about. Now I'm helping stop a foreign surveillance op with nothing but memory and a notepad." Harrington nodded. Some skills never lose their value. They just wait for their moment. And this was Thomas's moment. At 9:03 p.m., right on cue, the thermal plume began to rise. Invisible to the naked eye, it shimmered on their instruments like a pulse of living heat. The drone continued forward, unaware. "It's inside the field," Reyes reported. "Signals degrading. Stabilizers failing. Interference confirmed," another technician said. By 9:24, The drone was dead in the water, disabled by nature itself, with no human hand raised against it. "Recovery team, you are go," Harrington said into his comms. "Target neutralized at designated coordinates." A low cheer rippled through the room, not loud or boastful, but full of relief and quiet pride. Thomas said nothing. He just looked out across the black water, where nothing at all had changed, and yet everything had. Later that night, as the buzz died down and the coffee ran cold, several officers approached him, one by one. They asked for more insights. They jotted notes when he spoke. One young analyst even asked for a copy of his hand-drawn depth chart. And for the first time in years, Thomas Grady felt seen, valued, needed. He wasn't a relic. He wasn't in the way of progress. He was the missing piece, the one thing no satellite, drone, or algorithm could replicate. He was the watchman, and he always would be. 3 days later, the last of the black SUVs rolled down the gravel road, leaving behind nothing but tire marks in the dust and a lighthouse that felt oddly quiet again. The command center was gone. The cables were coiled and packed. The radar gear had been unmounted. All the high-tech bustle had vanished, as quickly and quietly as it had arrived. Thomas Grady stood in his kitchen, holding a cup of fresh coffee brewed from a sleek, industrial-grade machine the Navy had accidentally left behind. A small gesture, they'd said. Thank you. But Thomas understood. It wasn't just a coffee machine, it was acknowledgement. Commander Harrington had been the last to leave. Before stepping out the door, he handed Thomas a sealed envelope and a matte black phone. "It's a secure line," he explained, "in case you ever see something again. Something that doesn't belong." Thomas accepted both items wordlessly. "There's also a letter inside. Official commendation. And an offer." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "Offer? We'd like to keep you on, unofficially, of course, as a regional maritime domain awareness consultant. Nothing that would interfere with your duties here. Just a pair of trusted eyes. When we need them most." Thomas didn't answer right away. He just gave a slow nod. "You know where to find me," he said. And with that, the commander was gone, leaving behind only the hum of the lighthouse generator and the distant call of gulls overhead. _________. Life settled back into rhythm, at least on the surface. Thomas resumed his daily rounds, checking the lens, updating the weather log, scanning the waters just as he always had. But something had changed. There was a new confidence in his step. A sense of purpose that had once felt faded now ran strong through his veins. His observations weren't just routine anymore. They were part of something larger, something important. And that letter in the envelope? It came with a monthly stipend large enough to replace the rusting roof panels and upgrade the generator. More than that, it came with validation, written in official Navy letterhead, stating that his actions had helped neutralize a major intelligence threat and preserve national security. A few days later, the Coast Guard finally arrived. The original patrol Thomas had contacted about the strange lights. The young officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. "We got your report, sir. Sorry for the delay. Been a busy week." Thomas smiled, watching the cutter bob gently offshore. "No worries," he replied. "Nothing unusual to report now." The officer jotted a few notes and climbed back aboard. They had no idea what had happened here. No idea that just days before, this quiet lighthouse had become the heart of a classified operation. And Thomas didn't feel the need to tell them. Some stories, after all, aren't meant for casual conversation. That night, Thomas stood once again on the gallery, Rusty at his side, the sea stretching out before him, still dark, still mysterious, still full of secrets. But now he understood something deeper. That wisdom earned over time, patience honed through repetition, and a life spent paying attention could still matter, even in a world run by machines. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the horizon, steady and sure. And behind it stood a man, watching, listening, ready. Not because it was his job, but because it was who he was. The watchman of Beacon Cliff. And he was still on duty. In an age where satellites scan every corner of the earth, where algorithms predict the tides and machines track the skies, it was one man, standing alone in a lighthouse, who saw what the data missed. Thomas Grady didn't have advanced degrees or cutting-edge technology. What he had was time. A lifetime of observation. A quiet mind, a steady hand, and a deep understanding of the sea that only comes from truly living with it. His story reminds us that no matter how fast the world moves, there is irreplaceable value in experience, in listening, in simply paying attention. And sometimes, it takes an old lightkeeper to protect a nation. If you found this story as powerful as we did, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold tales, and share this with someone who still believes in the quiet strength of ordinary people. This has been another story from HAI Stories, where everyday lives become extraordinary. Until next time, keep watching the horizon.